The studio lights were harsh that afternoon in 1985, casting long shadows across the mixing console at 150 Studios. Eddie Van Halen sat hunched over his guitar, fingers moving across the fretboard with the precision that had made him a legend. The tape was rolling, capturing what would become one of the most pivotal moments in rock history, though not for the music being recorded. David Lee Roth stood in the vocal booth, his signature smirk visible even through the glass partition. What he said next would detonate a feud that would span 2 decades, destroy one of rock's greatest partnerships, and reveal a side of Eddie Van Halen the world had never seen. The guitarists who worshipped Eddie knew him as a technical genius, a humble innovator who revolutionized the instrument. But they didn't know about the other Eddie, the one who kept score, who remembered every slight, every insult, every moment of disrespect. And David Lee Roth was about to learn that some debts take 20 years to collect, paid back in humiliation, sabotage, and the systematic erasure of a man's legacy from the very band he helped create. Before we continue with this story of betrayal and revenge, if you're fascinated by the untold dramas behind rock's greatest legends, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the shocking truths that shaped music history. The tension between Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth had been building for years before that fateful studio session, but most fans saw only the surface. The carefully constructed image of 4 California rockers living the dream. Behind the platinum albums and sold-out arena tours, a power struggle had been quietly intensifying, a battle for creative control that would ultimately tear apart one of the most successful rock bands in history. Eddie had always been the musical architect of Van Halen, the one whose fingers created the sounds that defined a generation. But Roth commanded the spotlight with his acrobatic stage presence and carnival barker charisma. For years, this division of labor had worked, each man occupying his own territory in the Van Halen empire. But by 1984, as the band reached the absolute peak of their commercial success with the album that bore that year's name, the foundation was already cracking. Eddie had begun to chafe at Roth's insistence on maintaining the party rock image, the endless parade of hot babes and cold beer that had become the band's calling card. Eddie wanted to experiment, to stretch beyond the 3-minute anthems that had made them famous. He had keyboards now, synthesizers that opened up sonic possibilities Roth couldn't understand and didn't want to explore. The 1984 album had been a compromise, Eddie's synth-driven Jump becoming their biggest hit while Roth got his traditional rockers like Hot for Teacher. But compromise was becoming impossible, and neither man possessed the temperament for long-term peace. The breaking point came during the sessions that would eventually become the 5150 album, though Roth wouldn't be there to see it completed. Eddie had converted his home into a state-of-the-art recording facility, pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into equipment and soundproofing, creating a space where he could work without the constraints of commercial studio time. It was his sanctuary, his laboratory for sonic experiments, and having Roth there felt like an invasion. The singer had shown up late, as usual, his blood alcohol content already elevated, his patience for Eddie's perfectionism already exhausted. They had been working on a track for hours, Eddie layering guitars, adjusting tones, chasing a sound that existed perfectly in his head, but remained frustratingly out of reach in reality. Roth watched from the control room, drinking, growing more agitated with each passing minute. Finally, as Eddie announced he wanted to try yet another take, Roth's patience snapped. He leaned into the talkback microphone, his voice crackling through the studio monitors with crystal clarity, and said the words that would haunt their relationship forever. "You know what your problem is, Ed? You think you're the star of this band. But here's the reality, buddy. You're accompaniment. You're the guy who plays pretty sounds while I give these people what they really came for. Without me out front, you're just another guitar player jerking off in his bedroom. The control room fell silent. Producer Don Landy, who had worked with Van Halen since their earliest days, froze at the mixing console. Alex Van Halen, Eddie's brother and the band's drummer, who had been sitting on the couch reviewing drum tracks, slowly stood up. And Eddie, standing alone in the tracking room with his Frankenstrat hanging from his shoulder, felt something cold and hard crystallize in his chest. He didn't respond. He didn't explode in anger or defend himself or engage in the shouting match Roth was clearly trying to provoke. Instead, Eddie carefully unplugged his guitar, placed it on its stand with meticulous care, and walked out of the studio without saying a word. He wouldn't record another note with David Lee Roth for 11 years, and when they finally reunited, Eddie's revenge would be so complete, so devastating, that Roth would spend the rest of his career trying to rebuild his reputation. What happened next became the stuff of rock legend, though the full story remained hidden for years, known only to those inside the Van Halen inner circle. Eddie didn't make a public statement about Roth's departure, didn't grant interviews explaining his side of the conflict, didn't engage in the media circus that followed. Instead, he went back into his studio and did what he had always done best. He created music. But this time, the music would be specifically designed to prove Roth wrong, to demonstrate that Eddie Van Halen was not accompaniment, that the Van Halen sound could not only survive without David Lee Roth, but could actually thrive, could evolve beyond the party rock prison Roth had tried to maintain. Eddie recruited Sammy Hagar, a vocalist with actual range and musical sophistication, someone who could match Eddie's ambitions rather than fighting against them. The resulting album, 5150, became Van Halen's first #1 record on the Billboard charts, a commercial triumph that completely vindicated Eddie's decision and publicly humiliated Roth, whose own solo career was struggling to gain traction. But commercial success wasn't enough for Eddie. The insult had cut too deep, the wound to his pride too severe to be healed by album sales alone. Roth had questioned his musicianship, had reduced his contributions to mere accompaniment, and Eddie would spend the next 2 decades systematically proving that without him, David Lee Roth was nothing. The first phase of Eddie's revenge was subtle, almost imperceptible to casual observers, but devastating in its effectiveness. Whenever journalists asked about the Roth era, Eddie would smile politely and redirect the conversation to the current lineup, to the music he was making now, to the future rather than the past. He refused to acknowledge Roth's contributions to the band's success, wouldn't validate the singer's role in creating the Van Halen mythology. In interview after interview, Eddie would credit his brother Alex, would praise Sammy Hagar's vocal abilities, would discuss Michael Anthony's bass lines, but Roth's name would go unmentioned, as if those first 6 albums had materialized out of thin air. This erasure was calculated and relentless. Eddie understood that in the music business, relevance is everything, and by refusing to acknowledge Roth's past importance, he was actively diminishing the singer's present value. Record executives noticed, promoters noticed, and most importantly, fans noticed. The message was clear. David Lee Roth was replaceable, a colorful footnote in the Van Halen story rather than an essential element. Meanwhile, Eddie and Sammy Hagar produced 4 consecutive #1 albums, a streak of commercial dominance that the Roth era had never achieved. Every chart position, every sold-out arena, Every platinum certification was another data point in Eddie's argument. The band was bigger without Roth than it had ever been with him. But Eddie's masterpiece of revenge was still years away, waiting for the perfect moment to be unveiled. That moment came in 1996, when mounting pressure from fans, record executives, and even the other band members finally convinced Eddie to agree to a reunion with Roth for the MTV Video Music Awards. The performance was supposed to be a celebration, a nostalgic acknowledgement of the band's classic era, a moment for old fans to relive their youth and for Van Halen to demonstrate their legendary chemistry. Eddie agreed to the reunion, but what no one except Alex knew was that Eddie had no intention of making it a success. This was his opportunity to publicly demonstrate what he had known since 1985, that David Lee Roth, without Eddie's musical genius, was simply a middle-aged man trying desperately to relive past glories. The rehearsals were tense from the start, with Eddie showing up late, leaving early, treating the whole endeavor with barely concealed contempt. Roth tried to recapture the old magic, bouncing around the rehearsal space with his trademark kicks and splits. But Eddie remained cold, unengaged, going through the motions with mechanical precision. During the actual MTV performance, broadcast live to millions of viewers, Eddie unleashed his revenge in the most public way possible. His playing was technically perfect, but emotionally dead. Each note precisely executed, but completely devoid of the passion and energy that had made Van Halen legendary. He stood rooted to his spot on stage, never making eye contact with Roth, never smiling, never engaging with the performance beyond the bare minimum required. And most devastatingly, during Roth's signature moment, when the singer attempted one of his famous high kicks, Eddie deliberately turned his back to the audience, fiddling with his amplifier settings, stealing focus at the exact moment Roth needed the cameras on him. The performance was universally panned by critics, described as awkward, uncomfortable, and painfully forced. Roth took the brunt of the blame, with reviewers noting his desperation, his attempt to recapture youth that had long since faded, while Eddie was described as bored, above it all, clearly ready to return to making real music with his current lineup. The 1996 MTV disaster was just the opening salvo in the final phase of Eddie's revenge, because what came after was even more calculated, even more personally devastating to Roth. Following the failed reunion, there were sporadic attempts over the next decade to bring Roth back into the band, driven primarily by outside pressure and financial incentives. Each time, Eddie would agree, would participate in preliminary discussions and planning, would let Roth believe that reconciliation was possible. And then, at the last possible moment, Eddie would find a reason to pull out, to cancel the reunion, to leave Roth publicly embarrassed yet again. This cycle repeated itself multiple times, becoming a predictable pattern that the music press began to notice and report on. Each failed reunion attempt damaged Roth's credibility further, made him look desperate and pathetic, while Eddie maintained his position as the band's indispensable core. The message to the industry and to fans was unmistakable. Van Halen was Eddie's band, always had been, and Roth's participation was contingent entirely on Eddie's mercy. The final act of Eddie's revenge came in 2007, when financial pressures and the promise of massive paydays finally convinced Eddie to agree to a full reunion tour with Roth. Fans were ecstatic. Tickets sold out instantly, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the old magic might actually be recaptured. But Eddie had one more lesson to teach David Lee Roth, one more way to demonstrate exactly who held the power in their relationship. Throughout the tour, Eddie systematically undermined Roth's performances in ways subtle enough to deny, but obvious enough for Roth to notice. Microphone levels would mysteriously drop during Roth's vocals, forcing the singer to strain his voice trying to be heard over Eddie's guitar. Eddie would extend his solos far beyond their rehearsed lengths, leaving Roth standing awkwardly on stage with nothing to do, visibly confused about when to come back in. During the moments when Roth traditionally interacted with the audience, Eddie would launch into feedback-laden guitar explorations that made conversation impossible, stealing Roth's spotlight with walls of sound. Backstage, Eddie was even more brutally dismissive, arriving minutes before showtime, refusing to participate in meet and greets or promotional activities, treating Roth with the cold indifference usually reserved for opening acts. The tour was financially successful, but emotionally toxic, and by the end, Roth was visibly worn down, his legendary ego finally cracked by Eddie's relentless psychological warfare. In interviews conducted after the tour ended, Roth would hint at the difficulties, would mention feeling unwelcome, would suggest that perhaps the reunion had been a mistake. Eddie, meanwhile, said nothing, his silence more damning than any accusation could have been. The final chapter in this decades-long revenge came in 2012, when Van Halen prepared for another tour, and Eddie made a decision that perfectly encapsulated his capacity for cold, calculated payback. Instead of working with Roth to rebuild their professional relationship, instead of finding a way to move forward and let old grudges die, Eddie announced that his son Wolfgang would be joining the band as the new bass player, replacing Michael Anthony, and more significantly, that Wolfgang would be stepping into the spotlight as a featured performer, not just as a sideman. This was Eddie's final message to Roth. The singer was so replaceable, so unimportant to the Van Halen legacy, that Eddie would literally rather perform with his teenage son than give Roth any real creative input or partnership. Wolfgang was talented, certainly, but he was also Eddie's insurance policy against Roth ever again believing he had any power or importance in the band's hierarchy. The message was received, and Roth never again publicly challenged Eddie's authority or questioned his importance to the band's success. What David Lee Roth said in that studio in 1985 was meant to be a power play, an attempt to put Eddie in his place and assert his own dominance as the band's frontman and true star. Instead, it became the spark that ignited a revenge campaign lasting 2 decades, a systematic destruction of Roth's ego and reputation carried out with the same precision and obsessive attention to detail that Eddie brought to his guitar playing. The man who revolutionized rock guitar proved equally revolutionary in the art of the grudge, demonstrating that when it came to settling scores, Eddie Van Halen played the long game better than anyone. Roth learned, far too late, that there are some words you can never take back, some insults that can never be forgiven, and that calling Eddie Van Halen Accompaniment was the biggest mistake of his career. The guitar god had proven his point in the most devastating way possible. Without Eddie, Van Halen was nothing. But without Roth, Van Halen reached heights the singer could never have imagined. That studio session in 1985 lasted maybe 3 minutes, but the reverberations would echo through rock history for decades, a testament to the power of wounded pride and the patience of revenge.